We're in the last couple of chapters of Micah today. I am going to give a summary section by section through chapters 6 and 7. And then after we go through the summary, to get the kind of big picture of what's going on in these two chapters, I will drill down into a couple of specific places in chapter 6 and then basically cover most of the end of chapter 7. So in Micah chapter 6, it starts with Yahweh speaking again, and the wording to me, and not only to me, it also seems that in some of the commentaries I read, is very reminiscent of the opening of the book, where Yahweh just sort of descends from heaven, trampling the mountains and making his presence known in a big way, literally. Here, Yahweh starts sort of resuming what seems to be a kind of virtual trial of Israel, and he's asking the mountains to be the witnesses in the trial that he's putting forth with his own testimony. He seems to be filling the roles of both a prosecutor, making the arguments against Israel, and also of judge. Of course, he is the judge of all the earth. So he makes his case and also adjudicates it. And in this section, first 5 verses, he's reminding Israel of his own faithfulness through the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings that followed. So he's, in a sense, answering a charge that he has been unfaithful to the covenant. I think we always have to think about how Yahweh, God, interacts with Israel through the eyes of their covenant, and who is being faithful to that covenant and who is not. And Yahweh here makes his point that he has been faithful to his covenant, and here are some specific ways in which he has been faithful to it in the past. And then Micah in verses 6 through 8 is sort of musing how do we respond to Yahweh, given the fact that he is making this case against us? How do we respond? What's the proper way to approach Yahweh? And he concludes that it isn't with animal or human sacrifices, but rather to do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. That is the famous phrase that is in Micah 6:8. I have Micah 6:8 up on my wall on a plaque, and it's one of those verses that is the cross-stitch verse of Micah. And then he concludes Micah chapter 6 with a condemnation of the city, which I think in context could only be Jerusalem, for its wickedness and the wealthy inhabitants of the city. And Yahweh promises destruction and hunger for those who are well fed now, because they just copied the policies of Omri and Ahab. So he uses in this verse, following in the paths of Omri and Ahab, is the same kind of wording that should be used of following God, following in the paths and following the ways of the Lord. But instead, the leadership of Israel has been following in the ways and the paths of Omri and Ahab, which is leading them to destruction. Then in chapter 7, Micah starts with this section where he sees himself as nearly the last faithful Israelite in a nation of violent, selfish, evil people. He talks about how he feels like he's just the gleanings of a harvest. He's just the leftovers, because the majority of people are all in this evil camp. And to me, this section reads a little bit like we might read Elijah when he was feeling like the last faithful Israelite after facing down the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and he runs off and he feels like he's all alone. And God comes to him later and says, no, I have reserved for myself 5,000 people who have not bowed the knee to Baal. But that kind of feeling that Elijah had, that he was all alone out there, is kind of how this reads to me here in the first part of Micah chapter 7. He warns his audience to not even trust friends or family, because everyone is basically out for himself, and nobody can be trusted. And then in verses 7 through 10, Micah expresses his trust that Yahweh will be his light in the dark. He acknowledges his own sin. This is an interesting piece, and we will look at this in our detail. He acknowledges that he himself is sinful and subject to the judgment of God for his sin, but he also trusts that God will bring justice and will bring himself victory over his enemies, because it's implied, because he trusts God and loves him and seeks God's ways. And so that makes Micah different than so many of his fellow men in Israel at the time. And then Micah 7 ends with a look toward the future, when God will come again and lead Israel as a shepherd leads his flock, as he led them from Egypt to the promised land. And the earth may be a desolation because of the sin of the nations, but God is going to forgive the sin of Israel, remain faithful to his people as he was faithful to Abraham and Jacob, and he will take care of his people. So as each of the prophets has, except Jonah, which has its own whole trajectory, but each of the preaching prophets has ended with a note of hope, and a note that Israel will find salvation in God in the end, and will be vindicated against its enemies. And we see that same note here at the end of Micah. So that's the big picture. Let's drill down into some details. Micah chapter 6, verses 6 and 7 are this: with what shall I approach Yahweh and bow down to God on high? Shall I approach him with burnt offerings, with bull calves a year old? Will Yahweh be pleased with thousands of rams, with myriads of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? So this is Micah's question, and this is an answer to God's comment that he has been righteous in the face of unrighteous Israel. And so Micah asked the question, so how do I approach Yahweh? What's the right way to try to be in Yahweh's presence? The knee-jerk reaction from an Israelite is, should I give burnt offerings to God? Would be yes. But obviously Micah is sort of angling for the answer no, which creates a tension there. How do I approach God if it isn't through this form? Because that's what I've been told, and what even the law of Moses says is how we approach him, is through this path. But is that really the right way? And then of course he kind of amps it up with the last question, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? If an animal sacrifice isn't enough, is a human sacrifice of my firstborn, is that enough? So I think in an interesting irony, Micah asks, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? The answer is no, you're not going to sacrifice your own firstborn child, but God will. God is going to do that. Not that Micah says that here exactly, but we see Jesus giving himself up for our transgressions. And he is referred to as the monogenes in the New Testament, which is a word for the firstborn. The firstborn child was always in a class by himself for any family, because they were uniquely positioned as the inheritor of the father's estate and other things. So that firstborn had a special role, and Jesus is called that firstborn. And so he actually is the firstborn that will give his life for our transgressions, and give himself for the sin of our souls, ironically enough. But offering an actual child, our own child, is not what's called for. Micah gives the answer to how we approach, not through these other methods, but here in verse 8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does Yahweh ask from you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. The quintessential verse from the book of Micah. That phrase, to love kindness, is an interesting one, because the word kindness is actually a translation of chesed, the Hebrew chesed, which is so important as a word in the Hebrew Bible, because it is one of those essential qualities of God and of his relationship with people. The word chesed is translated as loving kindness, or faithful love, or other phrases underscoring eternal love, devotion, dedication, and that chesed is what we are to love. We are to love, and the word for love there is more of what we think of as like loving your neighbor as yourself, loving somebody, valuing it. And so we are to value chesed. We are to love in a sense, that loving kindness. We can't maybe always express chesed, since we're human and we fail. We can't always have it, but we should value it. Just valuing and loving chesed, having that as our goal, wanting to show chesed, is what we should be aiming for. One of the problems with Israel is that chesed has not been one of their goals, one of their overarching priorities. Instead, money has been, or power, or other things have been their priority, and not chesed. And so loving chesed is what God wants us to do. And of course, to do justice and to walk humbly with our God. And Jesus doesn't exactly quote Micah 6:8, but he comes very close on one occasion. In Matthew chapter 23, in verse 23, he is in the middle of his diatribe against the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. He's got several things he calls them on the carpet for in Matthew 23. But in this verse, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you pay a tenth of mint and dill and cumin, and neglect the more important matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness." It was necessary to do these things, the tenth, while not neglecting those, the three: justice, mercy, faithfulness. So Jesus hits two of Micah's priorities right there in justice and mercy, and he has sort of summarized walking with God as faithfulness, which I think is an apt word to describe. Walking humbly with your God is being faithful. So Jesus also shows the same critical importance. The Pharisees and the scribes have gotten their priorities mixed up to where they are obeying the letter of the law and not fulfilling its heart and soul. And that's exactly Micah's point. You could make your sacrifices all day long and obey the letter of the law. The letter of the law says you make an animal sacrifice. So is that enough, though? Is that how you approach Yahweh, is just going through the motions of making your animal sacrifice? Micah says no. Jesus says no. Stepping back to Micah into chapter 7, then, and this is where Micah is talking about how he feels like he's the only one who's being faithful, because all around him are all of these other people who are not acting right. He says, "Don't put faith in a friend. Put no trust in a close friend. Guard your doorways of your mouth and the one who lies in your lap. For a son treats a father with contempt. A daughter rises up against her mother. A daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law," which actually might be, of all those relationships, that one might be the most naturally tense one, maybe, perhaps. Are the enemies. The enemies of a man are the men of his own house. So in your own family, you're going to have people who are coming up against you, he says. And so Micah, in his personal context, is just pointing out how untrustworthy everybody is, even your own friends and family. In Matthew chapter 10, we see Jesus actually quoting this verse when he says to his disciples, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace on the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against his mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and the enemies of a man will be the members of his own household. The one who loves the father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, and the one who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." To me, this creates a question. Why is Jesus quoting this passage of Micah in this point? In Micah, the man against his father, the mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, all of this is a result of the people's selfishness and lack of faithfulness to their family and friends even. Here, what is the point? How is Jesus coming make this tension between family members to the point that they're turning against each other? It's not, Jesus doesn't introduce something new that is going to make them less faithful to each other. So what is Jesus bringing that is going to create this tension? And he kind of gets to it at the end after he quotes Micah, and then he says, "The one who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, and the one who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." So what is causing the tension then is devotion to Christ. When one family is not devoted equally, all the members of that family are not devoted equally to Jesus, they're going to have tension. And this could bring not peace, but a sword. So I think that when Jesus says this similar wording about himself, he's basically saying, I'm going to be the one to whom you need to be loyal above all others. And loyalty to anybody else but me is sin that you need to expose. And you shouldn't cover up for it, even if it's in your own family. And this will cause tension, maybe even violence in some cases, but it will be where your loyalty needs to be exclusively to Christ and to no one else. Micah goes on in chapter 7, he says, "But as for me, I will look to Yahweh. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. You should not rejoice over me, O my enemy. When I fall, I will stand up. When I sit in darkness, Yahweh will be a light for me." So here is Micah's stand. Unlike all the people around me, I am going to look to Yahweh. I am going to be faithful to him. He is the God of my salvation. And even if he looks like he's fallen and is in desperate situation, that is no reason to think that the enemies are getting their way, because he will stand up and Yahweh will be his light in a time of darkness. So Micah expresses total faith that any temporary setback he will overcome with the power of Yahweh on his side. And here's an interesting verse. He says, "I will bear the rage of Yahweh, for I have sinned against him, until he pleads my cause and executes my justice. He will bring me out to the light, and I will see his righteousness." So in this verse, I think Micah is confessing that he is not perfect. Even in his loyalty to Yahweh, he is not perfect. He does deserve Yahweh's punishment against him for sin. He deserves it. And when Yahweh punishes him, that's righteousness. But his ultimate faith is in Yahweh, and so he trusts that Yahweh will bring him through that. The punishment will not be destruction, it will just be for his discipline, so that he can be righteous in the end. But he admits that he deserves punishment too from Yahweh. He's not exempt. Even though he's faithful to Yahweh, he is not exempt from God's righteous punishment for the sin that is in him. And then he speaks of that future day when God is going to come and restore Israel fully. He says, on that day, he will come to you from Assyria and the cities of Egypt, and from Egypt to the river, and from sea to sea and mountain to mountain. And this is God coming to Israel, anywhere and everywhere, from the sea to the mountains, to Egypt, all the way to the Euphrates. God is going to find you and be with you where you are in all of that spot. It says, but the earth will be a desolation because of its inhabitants, for the fruit of their deeds. So basically, the desolation is going to come not by God's own doing per se, but because the people are just reaping what they sowed. The nations have been violent, unjust, selfish entities, and they're going to reap what they sow. That is going to destroy the earth, not by even God having to do anything. They're just going to destroy it by their own actions. They're going to destroy their own environment. Thing is that from the very beginning in Genesis, God gave humans the goal of caring for the earth. So Micah is sort of accusing humans of failing to do their very first instruction from God. Take care of the earth. Tend the garden and care for it and take care of it. And we're not. So generally the earth will be destroyed, but that isn't the end of the story for those who are faithful to Yahweh. In verses 14 and 15, he says, shepherd your people with a staff, the flock of your inheritance, those dwelling alone in a forest in the midst of Carmel. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in the days of old. As in the days when you came out from the land of Egypt, I will show him wondrous things. So Micah is saying that God is going to take care of his people. The earth may generally be destroyed, but God is going to find a place for them, his people, to have plenty. This is very much kind of an echo of Psalm 23, of being led beside still waters and where there's plenty to eat as a sheep. And so the God's people will be cared for and protected. Going on in Micah, the nations will see and be ashamed because of all their might. They will lay the hand on the mouth. Their ears will be deaf. They will lick the dust like the serpent, like the crawling things of the earth. They will come trembling from their strongholds to Yahweh our God. Let them fear and be afraid of you. So God's strength and power is just going to humble these nations to the point that they will just come trembling to God. The strongholds aren't going to keep them strong. They're going to come to God in humility and even in fearfulness with them trembling. While Micah doesn't play up the idea that the Gentiles will find salvation, as we have read in other places, like in Amos, where it specifically says that anybody who calls on the name of the Lord and of all the nations can be saved, this does, I think, hint at it. If they are coming trembling out of their strongholds to Yahweh, it hints that the Gentiles can have faith in Yahweh and can come to him. If they will come out of their own strength. Notice how he starts with it. It says, the nations will see and be ashamed because of their might. They are ashamed of their might and power. So they're going to turn their back on might and instead come humbly and trembling out of their strongholds to Yahweh. So I think there is a little bit of a hope there for the Gentiles to turn around and come to Yahweh, even though Micah doesn't necessarily play up on that part. And then in verse 18, he says, who is a God like you, forgiving sin and passing over rebellion for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever, for he delights in loyal love. And guess what loyal love is at the end? Chesed. He delights in chesed. So he himself loves love. He delights in having chesed and in showing it. He wants to show chesed more than anger. He does show anger, but he doesn't just dwell there. He prefers to show chesed to the people. And God is that one and only God who actually forgives sin. And he even passes over rebellion for the remnant of his inheritance. For the people who are faithful to him, he actually can forgive the sin, forgive the rebellion, act like it didn't happen for those who are faithful to him. He does not excuse it to the point that he just lets it go without any punishment, but he doesn't dwell on it. He's not resentful about it, and he does not extend punishment beyond what is appropriate. Rather, he does not retain his anger forever. Instead, he delights in that loyal love. In verse 19, he will again have compassion on us. He will trample our iniquities, and you will hurl all their sins in the depths of the sea. So God's trampling not the people, but the iniquities of the people. He is hurling the sin into the depths of the sea rather than the people. So he is dealing with the heart of the people, and in vanquishing those things that are keeping the people from being faithful to him. Trampling our iniquities, hurling our sins to the sea. This might be the quintessential hate the sin and not the sinner kind of verse that comes across here. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and loyal love, chesed, to Abraham, as you have sworn to our ancestors from the days of old. So here in Micah's last verse, he affirms that God is going to be faithful to his covenant, his promises, swearing to the ancestors from the days of old. So he is faithful to those commitments, to that covenant. In a sense, Micah has been a question. Who is being faithful to the covenant? Is Yahweh being faithful to the covenant? Are the Israelites being faithful to the covenant? Who is breaking the covenant? Who is keeping it? And the conclusion is that the Israelites are breaking the covenant. Yahweh is keeping it. But he is going to be faithful to that covenant even when Israel is unfaithful. God is going to stay faithful to his covenant, and he is going to continue to show faithfulness to Jacob, to Abraham, throughout this. Even when the people of Israel are scattered in exile, God is still being faithful. And he will show that faithfulness ultimately to his people. And of course, there is one way in which God is ultimately going to show that faithfulness in spite of everything that happens. Paul, in the book of Romans, hints at this here and there. This verse kind of brings it together in a similar wording to Micah, when Paul says in chapter 15, verse 8, "For I say, Christ has become a servant of the circumcision on behalf of the truth of God in order to confirm the promises to the fathers. In other words, Christ is that faithfulness. He is the one who is confirming those promises. And the fathers, of course, are the fathers of the patriarchs, if you will, the fathers of Israel, which include Jacob and Abraham and others. But he is the one who confirms those promises in Christ. So Christ is that one who, despite all of the other things and the ultimate unfaithfulness of Israel, God is faithful. And he has shown his faithfulness to the utmost in Christ himself, in Jesus. And so we live justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God as well by following Jesus. Jesus calls us to those same priorities, and it is in our ultimate loyalty to him that is what justifies us before God. You know, we are also guilty, but it is in having Christ and being in him and faithful to him that we are able to see the salvation of the Lord and have that confidence that even if we are unfaithful at times, if we maintain that loyalty to Jesus, we can see the salvation of the Lord in our lives, just as Micah did.